right, thanks for joining me today. It's kind of a weird one. I don't do the studio or homesteading videos a whole lot, but North Carolina is kind of in a weird position that a lot of people ask about this or comment about this. Or Southern Flounder in North Carolina has been closed for all of 2024 for the most part for recreational angling. And then a couple years back, there was shorter seasons, and things have slowly narrowed down to a closed season. You could do a little bit of research on your own. It's fun to read about the biology of southern flounder and learn more about them. But at the same time, there's so many open-ended questions. And the basic one is, how are we at a closed season? No other state has a closed flounder season. And there's really, I hit the top of my limit of understanding these fish. So I had a couple of guests with me today that I want to introduce them. Stephen Brewster here, probably a lot of people know him. He runs Anglers' Rights Alliance, Facebook group, a YouTube channel. Main goal is to organize and try to get an idea of what happened with a lot of fisheries management in the last 30 years. So across from me, I have the former director of the Division of Marine Fisheries. He's actually a real fishy dude. He's spent his whole life around fish too, and I want to introduce you to him and get his story of from angler to director and the passion of fishing that actually brought him into this room today and to talk with me about flounder. And everybody watching here is really passionate about fishing too. So I think you'll like to hear, where he came from and how he spent his life through fishing actually. So Dr. Daniel.
I appreciate that. It's good to be here, and hope people leave this podcast with a better understanding of what's going on in North Carolina as related to southern flounder. But I grew up in the Pinehurst Southern Pines area of North Carolina, and I started fishing when I was 3. And I went every chance I had I could. Largemouth bass was my typical quarry. But if I was in the mountains, I'd fish for mountain trout. If I was at the beach, I'd get on Johnny Mercer's fishing pier and fish for Spanish mackerel and flounder. Flounder was my favorite, really, back in the 70s. To age myself, you could drift a piece of cut lizardfish or cut mullet all across the bottom next to the pier pilings and catch flounders, pretty regularly, and come home with, a nice mess of flounders every day. Even at 12 and 13 years old, I was pretty successful. But I always had a love of the outdoors, but particularly fishing was my passion, and hunting and other things. But I went to school. It was preordained that I was going to be a doctor in my father's footsteps, and went to Wake Forest as pre-med and hated it. Took a invertebrate zoology course that turned me on to marine science, and I realized that that's what I wanted to do. And took a field trip to the Duke lab in Morehead City when I was at Wake, and spent 3 days out on the boats and in the field, learning about this stuff, and drove by the Division of Marine Fisheries office on Rendell Street and thought that's something I could do. And so I went home and I told my dad that I didn't want to be a doctor. I wanted to be a commercial fisherman. And he said, well, you should be the most educated commercial fisherman you can be. Maybe you ought to go to graduate school. And so I thought, okay, well, we'll go to graduate school. Went to the College of Charleston, where I was so fortunate to work with Charlie Winter on the early life history of red drum and speckled trout in South Carolina, where I did diet analysis and aging growth and reproductive ecology of speckled trout and red drum, but also got a chance to work on southern flounder, black drum, bluefish, and all the inshore sport fish down in South Carolina. And then I moved on to Virginia Institute of Marine Science for my PhD, where I worked on the early life history of black drum and trying to answer the question as to why we didn't see a lot of little black drum, but we had a lot of big black drum in Chesapeake Bay spawning. And that was a cool project. That's a podcast on itself, the results of the black drum study, but that's not what we're here for. But one day, maybe. But then I was at an Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission meeting representing the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which was a gig I had when I was writing my dissertation up in Virginia, and was asked to apply for the biosupervisor job in Morehead City at the Division of Marine Fisheries, and I did. And I got the job, and I came to Morehead in '95, and I was the biosupervisor for the Central District for a couple of years. And then my predecessor in the executive assistant position retired, and I was successful applicant for his position. And that's when I started to represent North Carolina on the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council. And I served in that role until I became the director in 2007, early 2007. And so I was during that time, I was the chairman of the biological review team. I chaired the management review team. I was sort of the technical advisor to the director on all the fishery management plan development and most fishery management plan development. But then I was representing North Carolina again on the South Atlantic Council, but also on many of the ASMFC technical committees, stock assessment subcommittees, and boards. So Press Pate, who was the director at the time, I was his assistant. And he gave me tremendous opportunities to do the work with the interjurisdictional fisheries management. And I really enjoyed that, fighting for the fish, but also fighting for the best interest of North Carolina. And I tried to do that, hand in glove. And so I kind of finished my career with the South Atlantic Council as the chairman of the council. And after I served my role as vice chair and chair for 4 years, I took the job as director and became the administrative commissioner for the state at ASMFC and ran the division until, I'll just say, I decided to leave and started my own consulting company, Coastal Fish LLC, and I've done some contract work, and I'm the senior marine scientist for the North Carolina Wildlife Federation presently, which has been a wonderful gig for me. And I teach a class on marine resource management and policy at NC State. And I was a contractor with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission and actually was drafted the first cobia fishery management plan. So that's sort of my background, history, stock assessments, fisheries management, fisheries biology. But, anytime I got stressed out at the job, it was great because I could walk right down to our dock behind the Division of Marine Fisheries and always catch fish, it seemed like there. And so I was always able to sort of clear my head by going out and catching a handful of speckled trout or weak fish or something down there at the dock, or getting in the boat and going fishing. Decompress.
Sounds like you're a really fishy guy. You've spent a lot of time. But lots of stuff can come through that. But I do want to ask you, what's your favorite thing that was to do in the field? Like, from a personal standpoint, I always find it really interesting when I do get to talk to marine biologists, because there's so many things that every angler likes to ask or probably learn. But just quickly, what was your favorite thing to do out there?
So many. So I've spent so many thousands of hours in the field doing so many things, from tidal creeks to deep sea work. But the thing that always got me excited every time I did it, and I did it a lot, was collecting my juvenile red drum and speckled trout for my thesis down in College of Charleston. We used block nets and rotenone, which is a sampling technique where you put a fish toxin in the water in a small restricted area, and you oxidize the poison before it can go outside the site, and you go through within about 5 minutes, depending on the water temperature, it blocks oxygen transport across the gills. And so the fish start coming to the surface, and you can row along with a little 1 millimeter mesh dip net. And we dip up larval fish, little juvenile fish of estuarine dependent species that you would have never thought were there. I mean, I remember we caught Goliath grouper and gag grouper and red snappers and lane snappers and, all these different oddball things that I would have never expected to see in these creeks. But then also the numbers of spot and croaker and weakfish and the little red drum and the little speckled trout and the little flounders. I mean, it was just spectacular to see it. And you just never, you can't get an appreciation for what the value of these tidal creeks until you've actually seen it like that. And it just was amazing to me. And I mean, the biomass of fishes, little fishes, thousands and thousands of them in these creeks. And it was just it was always exciting. It was like working in an aquarium store. And you could, you would see something strange all the time. I mean, bonefish, snook, in Charleston, it's just stuff you would have never expected to see. So that was the one, that was probably that was the one thing I remember most vividly and what was most educational thing that I did in the field.
I can imagine being a scientist and like stumbling upon a snook somewhere where you would never imagine it. Yeah, that would be really cool. Or a Goliath grouper somewhere that you'd be like, oh yeah, totally forgot that could be a possibility. Yeah, that's fun from a fishing standpoint. Yeah, I could see that. How I want to go out and see what that's like right now. But anyway, I unfortunately have to get to the meat and potatoes of this one. So Southern Flounder, North Carolina, it's closed. You go fishing last few years, your interactions with them are way up. It's really hard, unless you're trolling. For the most part, there's going to be days you're going to interact with them. You fish bait, you're going to find them, lures, whatever method you end up employing for the day. You're going to bump into the Southern Flounder at some point. Some days you just catch one or two. I don't want to exaggerate it. Right, you might just see one or two some days, and there's going to be periods of none, but then there's going to be periods of, you might end up interacting with a dozen for the day. We did not get a recreational season for 2024 due to the dead discards. Basically, 10% of flounder that are caught are assumed fatally released, and you can correct me in a second here if I'm wrong on that, but I think that's what based on my reading, if you catch a flounder 1 out of 10, it ain't going to make it. So that was the reason we didn't get a season for 2024. And I don't want to speculate too hard, but a lot of people that I talk to, myself included, are kind of worried we might end up in almost like a red snapper doom loop of we'll catch them, the recovery never happens to the numbers we're hoping to see, and then we're going to consistently have this dead discard loop going and going and going. But what's important too, I feel like it's important, as before I give it over to you, is we're kind of focused on this year, last year, where it all kind of, now it's on top of us that we're going to be dealing with this. But I think a lot of it has to come down to, I need to want to understand the 20, 30 years of period of getting to this point where I'm even speculating this doom loop of never seeing a Southern Flounder at my kitchen table again in my lifetime, or possibly children's lifetimes, etc. So you were there, and I think this is going to be hopefully really interesting to learn what actually happened, and also I want you to tell us about the biology of it. So that's important too.
Well, that's a broad opening, and it's tough. There are a lot of opinions, and there's no question that there are people that think everything's fine. There are people that think there's no problem. There are people that think there's a major problem. It's too little, too late, I think, is the bottom line. Because the first question I would ask some people that have just become involved in it in the last couple of years is, where have you been? We started working on the first Southern Flounder Fishery Management Plan in around 2005, I believe. And I'm sure there'll be people out there correcting the dates, but I can't keep all those as straight as I'd like to. But in 2006, we went in front of the Marine Fisheries Commission, and we told them we had a problem with Southern Flounder. And the problem was a result of such a decline in the age structure of the population. We weren't seeing the larger, older females. Southern flounder are kind of odd in many of our coastal fisheries in that the males don't get much over 14, 15 inches. But the females are the ones that are really the harvested fish now. With the size limits at 14, 15 inches, the vast majority of the harvest is our female flounder. And that's not good, just to start with. That's, you're underfishing the males and you're overfishing the females. And the females are the critical egg producer. So we went in and we knew that we were having a problem. Landings were going up, and we felt like we needed to do something. And because it was the most valuable commercial finfish fishery in the state, and it was always in the top 3 recreational desired fish, that this was a good species to do a fishery management plan on. And we had to do it eventually. And so when we did the stock assessment, we realized we needed about a 30% reduction in harvest. And so we developed the recommendations for what needed to be done, and we took it to the Marine Fisheries Commission. And we told them we needed to increase the size limit on the recreational fishery, and we needed to put in a bag limit, reduce the bag limit on the recreational fishery to achieve the reductions we needed. And on the commercial side, we needed to do some things, and we needed to close the season early. We needed to close the season, and I believe the date was November 4th. But that would achieve about a 30% reduction if we closed November the 4th. And so at the presentation during the commission meeting when they were there to make a decision, as I recall, the Marine Fisheries Commission chairman said they were going to hope that the division science was wrong because the impacts of a closure in November 4th to the commercial fishery would be catastrophic. And so instead of a November 3rd closure, they went with a December 1st closure, which really achieved no reduction at all. Most of the fish have already moved out of the estuary by December 1st, and you may have some years have gotten a 2 or 3% reduction, but you didn't get near what you needed. And so that was the plan. And so we had the lower bag limit, and we had a very minor season closure, but it didn't do anything. And 5 or 6 years later, we did a stock assessment, said the stock might be doing a little bit better, but we still needed to do some work. And I think the next amendment to the plan, which was some years later, we had just entered into the sea turtle issues, and there was this idea that the reductions in gillnet webbing allowed to account for the sea turtle bycatch would reduce the flounder harvest enough that the commercial fishery didn't need to do any more. And I think at that time we needed, instead of a 30% reduction, we now needed like a 40% reduction. So it was getting worse. And this was like 6 years into the plan, and we were supposed to be rebuilt in 2016. Okay, so we had 10 years to rebuild the stock, and started in 06. We should have been rebuilt in 16. But we never took the necessary action. And when we got to 2014-15 timeframe, when we started redoing the stock assessment, and there's a lot of history behind that stock assessment and the new information that showed that it was a migratory stock. But at the end of the day, we developed a supplement because now we needed this additional 40% reduction. How are we going to achieve it? And we came up with a reasonable good plan. And we put in quotas, and we had regional management, and we were going to divide it up between commercial and the pound nets and the gill net fishery. And the commission approved that plan in like 2015. All right. But as soon as it was approved, the North Carolina Fisheries Association filed a suit in court, and the implementing of the plan was enjoined. And so no flounder management could move forward until we did an Amendment 2. And so all during that time when we discovered that flounders are migratory, and all the stock assessments we had done had just been on North Carolina stock, on just the North Carolina fish. But in the interim, we discovered through tagging data that these fish are moving across state lines. Whether they're moving a lot, I don't know. I don't know that there's a lot of interchange between North Carolina and Florida, for example. But there might be a little bit between North Carolina and South Carolina, and certainly some probably between South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, because Georgia's so little on the coast.
Quick question on that.
Okay.
So you have the tagging data from North Carolina. Do other states share their tagging data with North Carolina also? Because I'm guessing Florida tags flounder in South Carolina. Do they like intershare? So like you can see if Florida fish go to, right now we might assume that a couple of North Carolina fish go to Florida, right? And a couple of them might end up in South Carolina. There might be some of them, but are the other states also kind of feeding that information on tagging back to North Carolina, their tagging data? Like if I caught a Florida tagged fish here, I never did, and I'm not assuming maybe that's not a possibility. But is that information getting passed along also?
Yes. Short answer is yes. I'm not aware. I'm trying to think of. I'm not exactly sure what tagging data is available and who's been tagging flounder. I know we tagged a bunch of them in Charleston in the late '80s, and that persisted through the '90s, I know. How much we tagged flounder, how much Georgia did, I don't know that Georgia ever tagged any flounder. I'm not sure Florida ever tagged any flounder. But if those flounder have tags on them, and those tags have a number, and you call that number in, and so because we work together, and so let me stop there for just a second and explain what I did when I discovered that we couldn't use the stock assessment we had just completed in like 2014-15 on flounder, at least not use it for management purposes, because we had discovered this migratory behavior. And so you can't just look at the population and get a fishing mortality rate on a migratory species just looking at North Carolina. You had to do a complete coast-wide stock assessment to get the stock dynamic, okay? And so what I did was, at that time, I was the chairman of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. And I went to the executive director and I said, I want to develop a Southern Flounder Fishery Management Plan through ASMFC and do it through the South Atlantic Board. And the executive director was like, oh, please don't make me do that. I've got so much going on right now with American lobster and other species that I just don't have the staff or the manpower to be able to handle, a South Atlantic plan. And I said, well, how about if the commission was to pony up some money so that the states of South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina could bring our technical people together and do a stock assessment that gave us that coast-wide view that we need to get? And he goes, done. So I don't remember what the amount of money was, but we were able to bring together the experts from the 4 states to come together and do a stock assessment on the coast-wide stock. All right. And that's the stock assessment we're using today. All right. With data through 2017. Now, I was gone from the division by the time all that was done. All right. I had left my position as director, but the stock assessment was done. And the stock assessment came back and said 2 take-home points. 1, the critical problem was the commercial fishery in North Carolina. And 2, we needed a 72% reduction now in order to achieve rebuilding to the proposed target in 10 years. So 2018 to 2028. Now, that's a real problem on multiple fronts, because the original plan was developed in 2006, and we were supposed to be rebuilt in 2016. Well, nobody seemed to be concerned that we weren't going to meet the rebuilding plan in 2016. And when it was asked about, the leadership of the state at the time said, well, we'll just add another 10 years. that didn't sit well with me. But that new 10-year period, because of the injunction to the supplement, didn't start until 2018. So now the plan that was supposed to rebuild from 2006 to 2016 is now we're not required to be rebuilt until 2028. All right. So 22 years later. All right. So we've got 3 years. We've got 3 years from today to have a rebuilt flounder population. And there's no way it can possibly rebuild by 2028. And so now you ask me why.
We're definitely not going to skip Y after that. We're not going to hit Y after that. So it's a lot. I think obviously that's sounds like it's heavy. First of all, like me listening to that, it's heavy. It does sound like there was a lot of stuff going on. So now we're 2024. We're going to answer some modern questions. I guess I have some modern questions too. Yeah. I think I'm really interested. So I was telling you before we started recording, like there's a stock assessment, right? There's a lot of a lot of people who say that, oh, you can't trust that. I'm not in that camp. I'm really curious to hear, and maybe you could communicate to everybody, like what actually goes on a stock assessment, because we see a PDF as the recreational angler. A lot of people yell and scream at it. I get a 75-page report. Some stuff I'm making my way through, but a lot of people say, oh, that's not accurate. Oh, they're fishing in areas with no fish, or they didn't have fish. They're not up to date with where the fish are. I think a couple of things comes to my head is how flexible are stock assessments. Like you might have, let's say, a really good spot had tons of juvenile flounder in 1990, but maybe doesn't have any more. But at the same time, I'm guessing if I'm going to make up a creek named Money Creek is off the best inlet in the state, probably should always have fish. And when you go to survey that, if that's not showing fish anymore, then I'm guessing there is a huge problem. But I guess if you could answer what actually goes on with the stock assessment. Is it flexible? Do methods change? Why should we at least use it to have a gauge of the health of a fishery or the starting point, and what is it actually surveying at the end of the day? Right. And that's it's a lot. Yeah, but maybe break it down to somebody like me who just sees a PDF.
Right.
When I do my own reading on it, because I'm curious and I'm trying to tune out all the noise, but I just see that PDF online and I generally come up with questions like, oh, it says, 50 creeks were surveyed, but are new creeks getting checked out? Or, some stocks move, that's really what it comes down to, is like the genuine fisherman's curiosity questions pop into my head.
Yeah. So I mean, this is the reason why fisheries management should be based on science and the recommendations of the scientists and not public opinion, in my opinion, because it is very complicated. And it's very difficult to explain to people that don't have a background in fisheries ecology, fisheries biology, fisheries population dynamics, to kind of explain all the nuances that go into a stock assessment. And they can be fairly simple, or they can be extraordinarily complex. And what I see and what I've seen in my career is that the more complex, the more uncertainty. But if you're a modeler and you're a stock assessment expert, which I am not, that's sort of where the interest is in developing these new techniques and testing them and seeing if they help you find out answers that you may not otherwise have been able to answer. Like, why aren't we seeing 5 to 8 pound bluefish anywhere? You know, some type of question. You know, what's happened to these fish? But in the simplest terms, you know, what a stock assessment does is it's not really looking so much at the abundance in randomized design samples. Those indexes of abundance can be used to tune the model. You know, it might be, you know, are the signals consistent? So are we seeing this significant decline in landings, but we're seeing an increase in abundance through our surveys? Why are we seeing this disconnect? You know, they can be all that can be very, very informative. But, you know, the bottom line data that's collected by the division, any state agency or the federal agencies, is basic harvest information that includes length, weight, sex, maturity. Age is critical factor. All right. And what we're seeing today is we're seeing more and more people wanting to go towards length-based modeling. And I think that's one thing that people are starting to turn to. And if you look at some new studies that have come out, one most recently in the journal Science, which is probably the most prestigious science journal in the world, stock assessments are not doing their job. They're not providing us with the necessary information that we need in order to adequately rebuild and manage these fisheries. That's what the science says. So we can argue about it till next week, you know, and you can bring in theories and ideas and say that there's other things that are involved, but overfishing is causing the problem. And with southern flounder, that's what's caused the problem. And we've not addressed it. We've not addressed it since 2006. And it would be my professional opinion that we're still overfishing flounder, which a lot of people might say, wow, in the heck is that possible? Well, the stock assessment is looking at the decline in the number of fish at age. So if you start with 1,000 fish age 1, and the next year you've got 700 fish that are age 2, that's a 30% decline, right? And so if you're able to track that decline in each cohort, which is each year class, you look at that decline over time, and eventually they disappear at some age, which is typically the maximum age that a fish makes. So for flounder, it's about 10. For red drum, it's 65. For speckled trout, it's about 12. You know, so most of these fish that we're managing in North Carolina live 7 to 10 years. And so you track those cohorts, those year classes over time, and watch how they decline from age 1 to age 2 to age 3 to age 4. It's going to be a descending leg, and the slope of that descending leg is the mortality rate. That's the simplest way to explain it. And you can go in and make it as complicated as you want to, and that's what we tend to do as scientists, all right? And we go in and we use all these different algorithms and bootstrapping and Monte Carlo distributions and all these things that nobody understands, or very few people understand. But the bottom line is if you see your landings decline to less than 10% of their historical average, and the age structure, instead of being 9, is mostly made up of fish age 1, 2, and 3, you can kind of get an idea that you got a problem. You know, and no, the fish didn't move to the Mediterranean And I'm not so sure that global warming has had that significant of an impact to our fisheries resources yet. I think it probably will, but I'm thinking that we're going to start seeing some of those snook and tarpon and ladyfish and some more abundant fishes from the south should be heading this way. They're not all just leaving North Carolina and nothing's replacing them from the south. So until I start seeing some bonefish on the flats in Beaufort Inlet, we'll kind of wait. Don't just use some idea that, well, the spot have moved to Manhattan, so that's why we're not catching any spot. But that's what, we'll come up with any kind of excuse to avoid the real problem that we're overfishing, and we haven't addressed it here in North Carolina. So here we are, 2024, 18 years past the original plan. Should have been rebuilt in 16. We got a 1 week commercial fishery and no recreational fishery. And people are scratching their heads and going, well, there are more flounder than I've ever seen in my life. Well, that's right. If they're rebuilding, we should see more. If you're not seeing more flounder, then we really do have a problem. It wasn't until we finally implemented a quota, 12, 13 years after the original plan, that we actually saw any substantive reductions in the commercial harvest. And what happened as soon as the commercial harvest was constrained? Those fish that they didn't catch became available to the recreational fishermen. And now recreational fishermen, for the first time in many people's lives, are seeing fish like they've never seen them before. And so they look at you and say, yeah, the division doesn't know what they're talking about. There's more flounder than we've ever seen. But they're not enough. And what's enough? The target biomass that we set, which is just 30% of what an unfished population would look like, or 35% in the case of southern flounder. So we're only trying to protect 35% what would have been there had we never started fishing for them.
My next question that immediately comes to mind, stock assessment. The other one is the target biomass. So lay it into me like an idiot. Like I've heard that term a lot, and I understand, I get an idea, but I want to have it be a little more clear why it's such an important term.
Well, I'm glad you asked, because it's the most critical term. All right. So if you're a fisherman and you want to catch as many fish as you can, are you gonna promote a low target or a high target? Well, you're going to pick a low target. It's easier to get there. You don't have to have as many reductions. All right. So in the basics of the target center around the aspect that the spawning potential of a population of fish that's unfished is 100%. Their spawning potential is 100%. All right. As soon as you introduce fishing to the equation, spawning potential starts to decline. All right. And it declines quick because unlike a deer population where your 10 and 12 point bucks are the hardest ones to find and the hardest ones to kill, typically you go to a new fishing spot and what do? You catch the big fish first. All right. Because they outcompete the other fish, or for whatever reason, they get out of the way, boys, I'm coming through. And so the first fish that come off a patch reef is the biggest gag groupers, the biggest red snappers, in a virgin spot that's going to have the larger fish. And so that spawning potential declines quickly because those larger, older females are far, far, far more important than these young, immature, or virgin first-time spawner females. And so where we have come in our understanding of spawning potential is that somewhere back in the early 90s, back in the mid 90s, they put out a paper that said that around 30% was a good benchmark for a target. All right, which means you've lost 70. But I believe that what happened when they started talking about that was really more for your shorter lived species that are very productive and were high capacity fisheries, not species that live to be 10, 12, 40, 50, 60 years old. And so I think you're being very risk prone to set targets at these historically, what I believe to be low levels, 30, 25, 30, 35%. And that really maybe more towards 45 or 50% is what's going to give you a quality fishery. That's what's going to give you more age classes, and it's going to give you better resiliency because you're going to have more age classes in your spawning stock. So you're going to have these larger, older females participating in the spawning event that are going to be spawning many, many, many more eggs. All right. So there's probably as many opinions as there is, on what's the most appropriate. And it varies based on how long the fish lives and how fast they grow and various other things. But what we've typically done here and in most of the states is we've picked these low targets to where the threshold below which you're overfished is set around 20%, 25%, which is extremely low. And the target is usually 10% higher. All right. So if the threshold's 20% below which you're overfished and your target's 30%, then that's what you're trying to get to. And you want to try to have that population vacillate somewhere around the target, knowing that your class strength is going to vary based on uncontrollable circumstances of weather and wind and tides and whatever. But on the flounder, we set, originally it was set at like 15.25. And during my tenure, I think we raised it to 25.35, and that's what it still is today. It probably should be higher in order to really achieve good production. But that's where we are today, is we need to achieve a 35% spawning stock biomass. Lost 65, 65's gone, so we're never going to have the age structure that we would have in a virgin population. But based on the science that's been done, we should see, we were seeing 8 and 9 year old flounders back in the day. So you would think maybe you would start to see a few of those larger, older fish show up, 7, 8, 9 year old fish, which we don't see. Now, people say they catch big flounders, but when you age them, they don't really come out. They're a 9-pounder might be 4 years old, which is pretty remarkable, the growth rates of some of these fishes. So, the stock assessment tells you essentially where you are with the spawning stock biomass. And that's how you determine whether or not you're overfished or not, is where your spawning stock biomass is and where your biomass today, estimated biomass is compared to what the target biomass is. So if you're trying to save money for a new truck and you need $10,000, that's your target. And your current biomass is $5,000. You got $5,000 more dollars to save before you reach your target. We're definitely seeing improvements, but because the commercial fishery has been reduced so significantly and the fish are available to the recreational fishermen and they're catching them, that we don't really know. We have no idea because the last stock assessment was through 2017. Okay. So that was, most of the fish that were assessed in 2017 are dead now. All right. So we really don't have any clue where we are in terms of where the biomass is. But what we know is that since we started managing this fishery in 2018 with a quota, we've gone over the quota every year. And what people will be probably saying in the background of this podcast is, no, we haven't. We haven't overfished. We haven't gone over the quota. The recreational guys went over the quota, but we didn't go over the quota earlier, and commercial fishery hadn't gone over the quota. But we're not accounting for all the bycatch that occurs that's not being accounted for. And the stock assessment clearly says, the one we're using, that there are no bycatch estimates for anything other than the gillnet fishery, which is incomplete in terms of the numbers. But none of the bycatch that occurs in the crab pot fishery, the crab trawl fishery, the gillnet fishery, the pound net fishery, the gig fishery, the shrimp trawl fishery, the unreported catches by commercial fishermen who don't sell their catch, the unreported catches from commercial fishermen who decide to retain some flounder for their own personal consumption. None of those fish are being accounted for in the stock assessment. None of those fish are being accounted for in the quota monitoring. And so if you're just looking at what's being landed at the fish house by the commercial industry, that's a small fraction of what's actually being killed each year when you look at the whole pie. Okay, so that's problem number one. The commercial harvest is probably somewhere in my estimates, and I could provide those in more detail, but the commercial mortality is probably about 3 to 4 times the quota. On the recreational side, you've got bycatch occurring throughout the year. You don't really know what that is. You probably are starting to lose some confidence in the recreational constituency that they're maybe not apt to tell you how many flounders they released because they might be a little anxious about it. So you might not be getting the best release information that you could have gotten and people are not happy about the fact that it's closed. But then you're also got these releases that are occurring so often, and the estimated weight of the releases used by the state is 0.2 pounds. When we know there are fish that are 3 and 4 and 6 and 8 pounds being released, I'm not sure, and I would like to know from somebody that knows better than I do, can you even catch a 0.2 pound flounder on a hook and line? I mean, I don't know what you would use for bait, but I guess if you're using, fish bites on a number 4 hook, trying to catch some hogfish, you might catch a 0.2 pound flounder, but a 0.2 pound flounder is not an average size fish. And so the estimated discards in the recreational fishery are probably an order of magnitude underestimated. So because we have failed to take the necessary action throughout the history of the Flounder Fishery Management Plan since 2006, we're now at sort of a catastrophic end to this whole thing. Because if a new stock assessment is done that says that we have been successful, I would very strongly question the results of that stock assessment because they're not accounting for the mortalities that are occurring in the population. And in my estimation, if you're not calculating the mortality, if you're not looking at the mortality of all the different fishes that are being taken, you don't have an accurate stock assessment.
This leads me to the next quick question that I'm thinking. So I guess next stock assessment, that was 2018. So I'm guessing any next year, probably the year after, something like that. All right. Whenever the next stock assessment comes out, there's going to be obviously 1 or 2 results. One, we're going to see that there has been no significant improvement, and then we're stuck in that. Or 2, there has been an improvement somehow, but based on what I'm hearing, I should taper my expectations to potentially hear that we might not see much of recovery on the next stock assessment that comes out, so that I should manage an expectation. Perhaps is what but really the next thing that leads to that is, so if we're going to see a maybe slight or a similar stock assessment from what we saw in 2018, what happens next in our brains? Like, okay, so the 2018, now we waited 6 years, whatever it ended up being, for this next one, and we're seeing basically the same thing happen again. A lot of people watching at home probably optimistic. Oh, we had a closure, just from everyday living, that you've seen the reductions, and you had a month, 1 year, and then nothing in it. The next one should be better. But if it's going to be kind of just more of the same, like what happens on that end is kind of daunting.
Well, I don't want to sound too doom and gloom, and I'm sure I have, but I kind of feel that way about it. But I don't believe there's any question that, what people are seeing is real. So we're seeing more flounder. We're seeing improvement. And there's no doubt in my mind that the next stock assessment is going to show that things are better, and that, the continued reductions will, for maybe another 10 years. It's not going to happen by 2028. There's no way, if the projections are right. So what they do is they say, okay, if we get this 72% reduction a year, every year for 10 years, the biomass goes up to the target. All right. So the fact, and there's an argument with some at the state level, that we have been achieving this reduction, which I strongly believe we haven't. The fact that we're still catching more fish than we should be, there's no evidence to suggest we've stopped overfishing, because we're not accounting for all the mortalities. And so again, it's kind of like saving for your target. We might be halfway there in the next assessment, but as far as I know, I don't know when another assessment is planned. I don't know when the states of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina are going to be willing to come together and provide the data that they have in order to conduct a new stock assessment. Is there a champion to get more money at the ASMFC to fund that what we did back in 2017? I don't know how they're going to do it, but what I do know is that, and I said this at the beginning, if we continue to manage based on public opinion and not the science, all right, and trying to avoid any impacts to the human element of this project, I was always told that, that 30% reduction in flounder for, closing November 3rd back in 2006 was the death knell to the commercial fishing industry if it occurred. And today we have a 1-week season. The economic apocalypse has already happened on flounder. And yet we're still arguing about what's the right thing to do. And, it's both sides, commercial and recreational. I live in Beaufort, and I've never seen such blatant disregard for the regulations by both sides as you see on flounder. And it's just a, people keeping them. They're not going to throw back. There are people that are not going to throw a flounder back. And Facebook posts and those people talking about fishing for flounders, and this, and you can get into all the little things, the oscillated flounder season and all these other things where the recreational fishery is closed out of all species of flounder. And I'm not trying to make this a rec versus commercial thing, but it really is important to look and see that if you take the two primary species of flounder in the state of North Carolina, the recreational fishery this year got 0. The commercial fishery got a season with their 350, 370,000 pounds and a 4, 5, 6 million pound quota of summer flounder. So being cut out of the summer flounder fishery completely by the recreational community. And, they're going to go to a 50-50 split eventually on the allocation of what's left, which is, people ask me what's going to happen. And I'll tell you what's going to happen in my estimation, and we'll see. Come back in 2 years and let's see what happens. So next year there's going to be a flounder fishery. There's going to be a season because the recs have paid back their overages this year. So in 2025, there's going to be a flounder season. And it's going to be one fish for a weekend, maybe a week. All right. And you're going to blow it out of the water. And you're going to catch twice. And I'll be surprised. So I won't say it won't happen, but I'll be surprised if there's a fishery in 26. Because I think you're going to be paying back your overage, even with your change in the split. You're going to probably be paying back a pretty substantive overage for 26 from next year's 3, 4, 5, 6 day fishery, whatever it comes out to be, because there won't have been, you're going to have an even better population of flounder next August, September, when the recreational fishery starts, because now there's not going to be any flounder caught between now and the opening of the recreational fishery in September. So all those flounders are going to be in all their traditional haunts. Everybody's going to know where to go. And what are people going to do? They're going to go out there and you're going to go to the spot and your first fish is a 16-inch fish. What are you going to do? You going to keep that fish and go in? Probably not. You're probably going to keep fishing till you catch that 5-pounder because you've been catching them all year. And so you'll keep fishing until you catch that 5 or 6-pounder, and that'll blow the average size. So this is speculation on my part, educated speculation. I may be wrong. But I know behavior. I know fishermen's behavior. And I know what's coming. And so I'll be shocked if we get another stock assessment between now and 2028. Maybe we will. All right. But I'll be really shocked if it shows that we've achieved the recovery goals, because if it says we've achieved the recovery goals, then everything from the last assessment and all the projections are wrong.
So, Dr. Daniel, with what you said about how people are ignoring the regulations, I have spent like the last 2 years just talking to people every single day. Anytime I see somebody fishing, I go up and talk to them. I find out what they know about the fisheries management system, how it all works, and kind of get a feel for what they think of it and how they're behaving because of it. And really, the general public throughout this entire time series, they sort of knew that they were always getting a raw deal, right? So that already caused frustration in people. But once you got to this year and you had truly two separate classes of people, which we've kind of always had, we don't really have equity. You have commercial and you have recreational, but this year it's really exemplified by the fact that the commercial guys get a season and the recreational guys don't get anything. And anytime you have a situation like that, people are going to start to break the law, especially if they don't really understand the whole system. So a lot of this stuff that causes people to behave this way is just a misunderstanding, really. A lot of people don't realize the difference between the DMF coming forward and saying that there are problems, and then the Marine Fisheries Commission making rulings that completely screw over one group and ultimately screw over both groups, really. But but don't work out in the long run. So you're taking a reduction, you're taking a reduction, you're taking a reduction. You don't see any benefit from doing this. But out of the recs that I talk to, it's pretty easy for someone to understand that if I let this fish go and someone else does not catch it, then it will grow larger and it will have babies. And that is a good thing for you. It's a good thing for me. It's a good thing for everybody. Easy to explain that to people. But what happens when you have this equity split is that people really start to kind of war against each other. So I like to use this analogy when I tell people about it. If you can imagine, we have the three of us, right? And in the other room in there are 150 gold nuggets, right? Now, each day, the three of us can go in and we can extract 50 gold nuggets, right? That's kind of where we're at now. Where we were at historically was the three of us could go in there and we could we could take as many gold nuggets as we wanted. And therefore, nobody cared that someone took more. But where we are now, you can imagine, if there's three of us, we can go in there, we can take 50 each day, and each day that remaining 100 will make a new 50, right? This is good for all of us in the long run. But what happens, and even if it's by decree of law, what happens when I go in there one day and I find out that you've either taken 70 yourself or you've been allowed to take 70? It's not really going to matter to me whether some legislator or commissioner said that this is a law, because this is just inherently wrong. Anyone's going to feel this way. And the ultimate result is people going and taking everything that they can get their hands on. A lot of people that don't understand the system are going to do that. And a lot of people don't have any faith in the numbers. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the DMF doesn't seem to be working for them. But we do have at least one historical account, and that is redfish. So, redfish was in horrible shape in the 90s, something like 3% of the spawning stock benchmark. And everybody kind of chipped in together with that one. We made a massive commercial reduction. We put a quota on them. We put a fixed quota that had paybacks, and the recreational sector went to one fish. And this was a very high, the benchmark for spawning stock biomass was set very high, much higher than we set it with other fish. And that's the only time we've really done that. And it's the only time we've chipped in. And today, not only do we have more reds, far more reds across the state of North Carolina, but we have a noose and a Pamlico old drum fishery that is, it is priceless to me and many other anglers, but it's also very, very valuable to the state. And the sustained redfish harvest that the commercial guys get is good for them as well. So I would really like to see us just do this more often. And people have to understand that throughout Flounder, we did not do that. We were not meeting those reductions that the DMF was telling us to. And like Dr. Daniel said, there's a very good chance that that we're not meeting them now.
What you're talking about is the precautionary approach, erring on the side of the resource. And yeah, I've been involved in this for 30 years, and I know the importance of the economic factor. But I just, I look at the estimated numbers of fish that we lose each year in the estuarine shrimp trawl fishery, as an example. And we haven't seen a spot run in 10 years. People will say they've caught a couple, but when was the last time anybody came in with a cooler full of yellow-bellied spot, commercial or recreational? All right. When was the last time you saw a bag of bloodworms for sale? So we're losing 350 million juvenile spot and croaker every year at 3 to 4 inches long. All right. Now, we're losing 200,000 pounds of flounder every year in the shrimp trawl fishery. That's not being accounted for in the quota. Just imagine for a minute, if half of those 350 million spot and croaker survived another 3 months, they'd be fall run spot. They'd be a harvestable product for the citizens of this state, commercial and recreational. It's like we've talked about. What are the gill netters doing now? There are no spot. There are no croaker. You can't catch more than 1 or 2 weak fish. Speckled trout's limited. There's no flounder. So here, and people talk about hatcheries. if you talk about red drum hatcheries and you talk about striped bass hatcheries and you talk about hatcheries that have been used in the rest of the country, which I have a very strong opinion about hatcheries and I don't think they're good. But can you imagine when they're stocking phase 2 striped bass, how many are they stocking? 50,000, 20,000, 10,000? You've got a natural hatchery in Pamlico Sound that's produced 350 million phase 2 spot and croaker that we're losing every year. And if you were to give those fish 6 months, 6 months reprieve, what would the biomass look like on the fishing piers and in the creeks and in the Pamlico Sound and in all of these places that these fish no longer occur? We've tried everything to keep the commercial fishing going the way it's always gone. Clam kicking, gill nets in the estuary, shrimp trawls on the nursery ground. We've done all that, despite all the other states doing something different. We're the only ones that do it to the degree that we do. And we're in the shape we're in today, where we've got no flounder fishery, a 1-week commercial season, and we're not willing to try anything different. And we're nibbling around the edges of what needs to be done to keep people from being upset and angry and making sure that there's no economic impact to anybody. When I say again, what has the economic impact been to the commercial, recreational, and business communities of Eastern North Carolina as a result of having no spot, no croaker, no flounder, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? But we just keep going down the same path, doing the same thing over and over and over again. And we're not going to rebuild these fisheries. And a healthy resource is in the best interest of everybody. And while I understand a man has to pay his power bill that day, there are not many people paying power bills based on flounder catches this year. And there won't be for a while.
Everybody needs to know that nobody at DMF has ever said that the flounder are endangered. They've simply said that the stock is overfished, and you can just fish a stock until it collapses to the point that nobody wants to go fish for it anymore, and then it recovers on its own, or unfortunately, like some of our other fish stocks, doesn't recover. You know, gray trout, sturgeon, striped bass, they're all probably not going to recover. And I know I can already hear some of the people out there saying, oh, there's so many of this or there's so many of that. If you go and look at historical accounts, there's absolutely no question that we've collapsed these fish. We have river herring as well. So really, people have to understand that there's a huge misconception with all of this stuff. And you can see it. There are protections. So if we try to wipe out invasive species, about 10% of the effort when we go to wipe out invasives, we'll get rid of 90% of this invasive species. The remaining 10%, depending on the particular animal that we're talking about, the remaining 10%, even for land animals, is nearly impossible to wipe out. So what happens is we push them all the way down there to that low, low, low point, and we wind up kind of staying there. Every time it tries to come up, we'll just push it back down, and it's resulted in us just having a terrible fishery that many people think, because it's been this way for so long, that many people think is really, really good. And of course, I think it's all driven by this lack of equity. That's what I think causes it. If people felt like everything was fair and they felt like I can release this fish and it's got a good chance of having babies and growing up, then they can understand that that's something good for their children and their children's children, and even for themselves. These fish grow fast, they multiply super fast. So every fish you put back, that is a good thing. Of course, there's nothing wrong with harvesting them, but there is a limit. Not even saying to wipe them out entirely, but there's definitely a limit to where you don't have as many as you could have had in the following years.
Let me conclude my comments by saying I want to say one thing to conclude, and that is, let's be real careful about blaming other people and looking at how other states do it. Why do we give a damn how other states do it? We're in North Carolina, all right? We've got a suite of state-managed species, newly minted state-managed species that include speckled trout, southern flounder, oysters, clams, bay scallops. You know, we need to concentrate on doing what's right for North Carolina. I keep hearing, well, that's, Florida's got fish, or they catch more flounder. Red drums, there's a problem with red drum in the southern part of the range. And I know that everybody's going to say, well, they don't have gill nets and they got a problem. They also land 5 times the amount of red drum in the southern region than we land up here in the northern region. And we got 5 times the habitat. So we've got a heck of a lot more productivity of red drum potential, in my opinion, in North Carolina and Virginia than they have in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Georgia, you can't even hardly count. It's a county. So when you start thinking, we're always trying to blame or say, well, what used to be that people said, well, we don't care what happens. Why are you telling us what happens in New Jersey? We don't care what happens in New Jersey. We're talking about North Carolina, and so let's get our side of the street fixed before we start worrying so much about what's going on in other states. Because I think if you start really looking at it and you look at it with a clear lens, you'll find that the other states are extremely restrictive. And North Carolina has a potential to be a leader to allow certain fisheries to operate that other states don't allow and still maintain a healthy fishery. And how many times have we heard that we have to have a net ban, we have to have a this, we have to have that in order to have healthy fisheries? Bans are a failure of fisheries management. But if you properly manage the resource, you can be successful.
You're going to have a hard time with the net stuff because there's so much. At this point, we've let it go so far that there's so much hostility that I wonder if it's possible to find a middle ground, if it is a possibility.
I believe we can have it. The difficulty is expectations. That's the thing that where the education needs to come in my opinion, is expectations. I mean, I don't think there's, certainly around this table, I bet we would all agree that if we all of a sudden went back to 5 red drum limit, the recreational fishery would wipe out the damn red drum population. Or at least wipe out every year class.
Way too easy to catch. We know how they work way too well.
What we know is that somewhere between 1 and 5 is where we need to be. How many times have I heard, if you take away, you'll never give it back? Well, if you're thinking we're going to go back to 10 speckled trout at 12 inches, that's probably unlikely. I don't know that fishery was ever able to really withstand that level of pressure. And I really believe that with speckled trout, that if you stick with the 14, if you stick with a slot limit and bag limit, and you control the commercial harvest through a pound limit instead of a number limit, and put in quotas, we're missing the boat without setting quotas and making sure that we get the reductions we need. But I mean, will we ever get back? I mean, thinking now about the fishery and looking at the landings of speckled trout in the recreational fishery and the number of releases, I mean, the releases would go down because everybody would be keeping those fish. They wouldn't be releasing them. But remember, for the most part, those fish are only having about a 10% discard mortality rate. So if you catch 10 and you let them all go, based on the data, 9 survive. So you can't say that just keeping them is better than releasing them. That increasing discards is a problem. Increasing discards is not a problem if you save more fish than you kill.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank all my guests here today. At the bare minimum, the education has been like, I open up a document, read it. Somebody opens up a document. Sometimes you jump on Facebook and you see comments. It's like, ugh. But reading through stuff and then hearing like a longer history of a lot of it. Anyway, everyone can form their own opinions. And I'm not even using this as for opinion based. If somebody wants to tell me something totally different, we could sit down for an hour like this too. But I just really wanted to learn that just the history, biology, and you learning that information is also just, the history of management and the biology of the fish. It just helps kind of complete the process of frustration, but not just frustration, just rationalizing everything for me. That's really what it comes down to. So I want to just give the last word to my buddy Steven here. Steven's a good dude. He's been working hard trying to get a different take at organizing people, or just kind of getting a voice across that's kind of unified or a little more disciplined. That's the word, a disciplined voice out there. So I'll let him just kind of close it out very briefly. And I want to thank him for organizing this, and hopefully we can do something else like this again. I had a good time with it, at least on the education aspect. I want to have as much of that out there as possible versus trying to dig through 20 years of PDFs that are half written, half not transcribed properly, and half of them are just chunked down with algorithms too. So anyway, Steven.
All right, my name's Steve Brewster, for anybody that doesn't know me, and I started the Anglers' Rights Alliance Facebook page, as well as I use my YouTube channel to make videos to talk about this stuff. If there are any of you who are unhappy about what's going on in North Carolina, I have set up a system for us to change that. And it's not just me telling you what to do. Absolutely anyone can go on there. You can call me, you can message me. And if you don't like something that I say, that's perfect. That's even better, because we have developed a people-powered system that I'm using through Anglers' Rights Alliance. Basically, we have a brief class, as brief as it can be, so that you understand the basics of what DMF is doing and how they function, what the MFC is doing and how they function, and depending on the fish or whatever we're talking about at the time, the status of that. From that class, we then go to a survey system, and that survey system is set up with input from the public. So if you think that all the things I've said are complete nonsense, then that is the place for you to go and get involved, because you can prove me wrong. I don't have an argument to win in this necessarily, but I do know that something is very wrong in North Carolina, and pretty much anybody can see that. If you look at the limit reductions and you look at what's happened over time, you look where flounder is, look where stripers are, we are headed to a very bad place, and it doesn't matter who you are. So we do have to get together in order to change that. Because anytime I go to legislators, what we most often hear is people aren't reaching out to us. They're not saying that they want things to be changed, and they use that to sort of brush us off. But the group is growing all the time, and we do everything from reaching out to the DMF or attending Marine Fisheries Commission meetings, submitting public comment, and all the way up to appealing to our legislators en masse. And if we can use this survey system to vote, and then everyone moves together, then we can actually get something done in the state. I absolutely know we can. So again, Fishing with Brewski YouTube channel, Anglers' Rights Alliance on Facebook. And yeah, you post a comment on the video, I'll be watching it too, and I can respond to you there. And you can reach out to me directly. Any and all information and input is always appreciated. Thanks, guys.